let's just start, if we could, with the definition of consent. I mean, it's a word that we hear so often and we toss it around and think we know, but do we really know what consent means?
Well, unfortunately, not only do we not know, but our laws don't know what consent is. But it's backed up by a lot of codes, so we're not just talking out of the seat of our pants. Consent is actually freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement by a person with the capacity to reason. Nuremberg Code tells us so, Model Penal Code, General Data Protection Regulation, even canon law going back for centuries has told us so. But for some reason, it's escaped the grasp of our legislators, and therefore it hasn't been put into law. It hasn't been codified. So it's not, it should be, it's a human right, but we need to make it a civil right.
And why is that so important? If we break down where our country, our world, in fact, but our country certainly is at a pivotal point with women's rights and the women's rights movement, with abortion and other rights being challenged, in every state across America. Why is it so important that the term consent have a definition and that it be classified in a different way?
The 14th Amendment to the United States grants us all equal protection under the law. But if the word consent, which is pivotal in determining guilt or innocence in most crimes, is not well defined, then when you get into a courtroom, whether or not you've committed a crime is simply, it's a crapshoot. It's not something that's consistent from one jury to another. The alternative that we see today is that a lot of states say that your words and actions determine whether or not you consented, but that completely disregards what consent is, because in consent, malicious influence would undermine your ability to consent. If someone used, I call them the 3 F words that should never occur in sexual contact, and that's force, fear, fraud, or by exploiting someone's incapacity, then you're not consenting, no matter what your words or actions actually are. But that's not how our laws read, and therefore we don't have the consistent ability to prosecute properly, not only in sexual assault, but in sex trafficking, domestic violence, in any crime in which consent is pivotal to the person's guilt or innocence.
Wow. Andrea, I want to get you in here because you're the founder of Hope, Healing, and Transformation. You're working with the victims, I would imagine, of a lot of these crimes. Why does this matter so much? Why does the definition, the term, giving it more power, why does that make a difference?
Well, it makes a difference in the lives of survivors. And, the work that I'm doing at the foundation really is about healing. It's about healing the trauma. So the work that Joyce and I differ. Joyce's organization is about consent. For me, it's about healing. There were 2 trials in my case against Bill Cosby, and the jurors in the second trial, while they were deliberating, they went back to the drawing room and they asked the judge what the definition of consent was. And the judge said to them to basically use their common sense. And I was just astounded that there was no definition in my case. And so for me, a lot of the work that I'm doing with Joyce is about defining consent. And so for me, I do believe that it would have had a different even though the outcome was successful in my case, I do believe that it might have even changed the first trial, So I think it's important to do that. I think we need to hold predators accountable. I think every survivor that comes up through the system after me deserves to have the best deserves to have people fighting for them and trying to change the laws, because it's hard enough and difficult enough to report what has happened to you after being sexually assaulted. And we shouldn't make it any more difficult or re-traumatizing for survivors to go through the system. We have to do this, and we have to get a legal definition of consent in order to really push the work forward. and really make a difference in the lives of survivors in the future.
You know, these high profile cases that have made the news are the ones that have come to light, but there are hundreds, if not thousands, of cases where victims who don't ever see the light, you know, get the media's attention, are suffering. And I have to apologize because I keep saying victims, but even that word matters, right? I think we call them survivors now, not victims, right? Right.
You know, I actually was at the Weinstein trial here in New York. In the Weinstein trial, the jurors asked the same question and they got the same answer. They got the answer, use your common sense. But what's really unfortunate about our laws is that it enables the defense attorneys literally to tear apart the victims on the stand. And it becomes a question of, what did you do? What did you wear? Have you had a sexual relationship with this person previously? You know, all those things really are not really specific to the crime. The crime is a crime because of what the offender did. And if the offender uses malicious influence, then you're not consenting, whether you say yes or whether you comply. You know, if you're complying because you've been maliciously influenced, you're not consenting.
That's very, very interesting, especially because we have so many young girls right now that are college age, that, you know, that are finding themselves in these situations where they might be intoxicated or drugs might be used or something like that. And then later they come out and say they were raped or they were assaulted. And that question does come, well, were you already in a sexual relationship with this person previously? I do want to play devil's advocate for a minute, though. We don't have the other side on this you know, interview right now. However, the flip side of this is that if you are the person, the perpetrator, then you also want to know that common sense is going to be used in your case, I would imagine. You want to make sure that you also have the same right to be able to prove your innocence. Does this impact the perpetrator's right?
It impacts them in actually a very positive way, because it makes prosecution much more simple. It's a question of whether the person used malicious influence or whether they didn't use malicious influence. So all those things that the victim is dragged through really has no bearing on whether or not the accused is actually guilty or innocent.
So Andrea, if I could ask you, because we're talking now about that influence, right? In your case with Bill Cosby, the fact that the perpetrator is in a position of power, does that then add to that you know, definition that we're talking about right now, that in fact could have an impact on a case?
Well, it's kind of like a two-pronged thing. I think in my situation, the jury would have I don't think there would have been much deliberation in my case, to be honest with you, because you have to look at incapacitation and how defining consent in this situation involves incapacitation. If you weren't aware, I was given 3 pills and I was unconscious. And so I think for me, had the jury had this definition in their hands, they would have basically said that if we believe the victim, then she's met that threshold of being incapacitated. So, and then the other thing really is it has to do with the jury. You know, it's defining consent. It doesn't necessarily, it affects maybe the prosecutors and the defense attorneys, but also it helps the juries come to a decision. And the jurors didn't have a definition to work with. And so I think when jurors are deliberating, it would actually help them. It would actually be a positive for them.
Right. And one last question for you, Andrea. Can you just remind our viewers the outcome of your case?
The outcome of the second trial was that he was found guilty of indecent assault on all 3 charges. And the deliberations lasted about just over 24 hours. And so it was a good outcome in my case. And the juror foreman for my case, her name was Cheryl Carmel. She knew the definition of GDPR. And when the jury wasn't given a definition from the judge, she went back to the drawing room with the jurors and said, well, this is the definition that I know. It's the GDPR definition. And in a nutshell, it's about freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. And so, it's interesting that once they had a definition to work with that wasn't given to them by the legal system, they were actually able to come to a conclusion. And so it goes to show that having a definition for consent in our penal code, in the legal system, will change the outcomes and hold predators accountable going forward. We need to change the laws in order to make a real impact and carry all the work forward that we've been doing in the Me Too movement and women's civil rights. We need to have change, and this change is going to be good for the whole system.
Me Too raised awareness, but it's a movement in need of a solution. And the solution is defining consent in our laws. There are different types of agreement that can occur between people. You can assent, and this goes back to what you asked about fear. The minute you introduce fear as an influence, then you're getting the person's acquiescence, right? Acquiescence is agreement under duress. If you trick the person, they're agreeing on the face of it. That's called assent, not consent. So the difference is assent is agreement on the face of it, acquiescence is agreement under duress, and consent is freely given, knowledgeable, and informed agreement. So I think that answers your question about how fear impacts.
Sure.
And also the incapacity of a person would render whatever they did while they're unconscious totally non-consensual.
Absolutely. Well, listen, I want to thank both of you for joining us today and also for continuing to fight on behalf of women and survivors, male and female, in our country. Where can we find more information or get involved?
We have a petition that people can sign in order to support the bill that we have pending in New York. We also have passed recently an amendment to the National Defense. It will affect UCMJ, which is military law. So you can actually go online to it's a change.org petition that says our justice system is broken, and sign our petition. That would be tremendous. You can get a copy of Your Consent, The Key to Conquering Sexual Assault on Amazon. And you can also log into the Consent Awareness Network on our webpage.
Okay, very nice. Joyce Short and Andrea Constand, thank you so much for joining us. Please keep in touch with us at iWoman TV. Let us know how this bill is progressing and if there's anything that we can do to get behind you to support.